Okay, it looks like it's time for us to go ahead and get started here. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Northwest ATTC webinar. I'm Jennifer Verbeck, and I'm your host for today. We're excited to have Linda Segur presenting for us today on meeting clients where they are using a neuro-informed lens. And we are offering this presentation in partnership with the Parent and Child Assistance Program, which is in the Fetal Alcohol and Drug Unit at the University of Washington. Next slide. I have a couple of quick housekeeping things. First, if you have any questions for our presenter, please type them into the chat box at any time, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. Next slide. You'll also be getting an email at the end of the webinar today that has a link to a survey in it. Please take that survey as it helps us make sure we're bringing you the content you're most interested in. And it also helps us continue offering free or low-cost events like this one. That email will also have a link to download the slides from today and a link to our website where you'll be able to find a recording of this webinar, and that should be available later this afternoon. Next slide. Additionally, we'll be sending everyone who attends this live webinar a certificate of attendance, and it takes us about a week to get those out. You don't need to do anything to get the certificate unless you're watching this in a group, and if that's the case, please have someone in the group email us within a business day with the names and email addresses for everyone who wants the certificate. And our email address is up there on the slide. It's northwest@attcnetwork.org. And I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker, Linda Segur. She brings over 35 years of experience in human services, specializing in families impacted by substance use, poverty, and mental health issues. She spent 10 years as a co-occurring disorders clinician in the Kitsap Mental Health Pathways Program and 14 years providing parenting support through the Kitsap County Drug Court. And with that, I'll turn it over to her to finish introducing herself and what the PCAP program is. Thank you so much for joining us today, Linda. We really appreciate your time.
Got myself unmuted there. Well, hello. So as Jennifer mentioned, my name is Linda Segur, and I currently work, I have since 2016 for the University of Washington Addictions, Alcohol and Drug Unit Institute, ADAI, for a program called PCAP. PCAP has been around since the early 1990s when it started as a pilot program, specifically doing outreach to women who were identified as, at that point, using crack cocaine in high-risk pregnancy and postpartum situations. Over the years, it's evolved to a program that now serves 1,500 women across the state of Washington, based in 20 different counties. I am the clinical supervisor of one of those programs, and I'm in the county that is, if you're familiar with scenes of Seattle where the ferry is going away from Seattle, I'm on the other side of that ferry. So I noticed that some of you are from out of state, and I just wanted to say, welcome, come visit. If you're curious about PCAP, I'm always happy to share more about it. It's an amazing program. At this point, these are the aims of PCAP as listed at the University of Washington website for the program. We work primarily with pregnant and postpartum clients with prenatal substance use. We do enroll people up to the index child's second birthday and provide 3 years of intensive case management. Aimed primarily at the mother. So we're helping mothers with at-risk substance use during pregnancy with the idea that we'll help them achieve and maintain recovery, increase stability and build healthy family lives, and then to avoid exposing future children to alcohol and drugs prenatally as well. Eligibility, the people that are coming into the program are primarily people that were, always people that were born women, although not necessarily identifying as a mother at this point. They can be anywhere from finding out they're pregnant to 24 months postpartum. There has to have been some at-risk substance use during pregnancy, and or they're currently using a version of medication for opioid use disorder. And generally, the women that are coming in, the people that are coming into the program need help connecting to recovery supports. Again, it is an amazing program. So there's me. And let's go ahead and get started on the content, because I'm always optimistic with the amount of information I can cover in an hour. So I really will welcome your questions, and I have a timer set so that we can answer any questions or discuss a few things at the end as well. So overall, my hope is that we will have a chance to take a deep dive into the predicting brain process. This is based on the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett. Dr. Feldman Barrett is a neuroscientist and a professor at Northeastern University in Boston. She's written several books, and I'll give you some information on how to access her website at the end of the presentation. And it was interpreted to me through a man named Rick Griffin, who has been a mentor and a teacher and is a master trainer in the information as well. So we're going to look at some knowledge about what that brain process is, with the hope that it will help us build insight, and we'll think about that as a larger framework for supporting resilience, strategies to support resilience. Overall, what I've found, especially as I've become more familiar with this information, is strategies need to be tailored. We can talk about wonderful strategies and ways of communicating, and the reality is, once you really look at the predicting brain and gain some insight into how the relationship between the helper and the person who is seeking the help, it really is an individualized thing when it comes to strategies, especially when people have a long history of traumatic experiences. So I'm going to offer this all from a boots on the ground perspective. I'm not a neuroscientist myself, but I sure have been helped by this information. I find it exciting and renewing, and it keeps me happy and satisfied with a career that really has lasted more than 35 years. So again, what I do most days is work with PCAP, and what I wanted to emphasize is that PCAP, one of the foundational theories, and certainly the primary practice, is to use relational principles to connect clients to recovery supports, to kind of help launch them on their way at a point where there's some real motivation to make changes in their life. So kind of taking that and catapulting it on. We recognize in PCAP that there's a lot of inequities when it comes to people who are pregnant and parenting women, who are also dealing with substance use disorder, and they're intersecting inequities. Overall, there's a lot of data that points to how underrepresented people, pregnant and parenting women, are in the substance use disorder treatment field, overrepresented in child welfare cases, over disproportionately reported and punished for prenatal substance use when people are coming from ethnic and socioeconomic minorities, that there's intersecting systems of surveillance that really make it hard for women in this situation to access prenatal care, and that also there's the reality that substance use disorder does hamper the ability to care for children who have special or higher needs as well. Looking at it again, poverty, trauma, and discrimination insist that we really do take a whole person lens. People are more vulnerable to substance use disorders. There's limited access to prevention and care, and more social and economic instability. This isn't a social justice training. I really want to focus on the science as I understand it around the predicting brain process. But I think we would all be remiss if we didn't look at the bigger picture about equity when it comes to women who are dealing with both pregnancy and postpartum issues, and also a substance use disorder as well. it's a complex picture. And there are, of course, no simple answers to complex problems. So sort of my bumper sticker wisdom in a lot of ways. We see it every day here at PCAP and are always seeking to find answers to collaborate in the community to help the women themselves begin to advocate in the community as well for themselves. That's an important part of the program. So PCAP, the Parent-Child Assistance Program, has been gathering data since the late 1990s. And I didn't attempt to put a year range on this because the data from the last 20 years really plus or minus a percentage point continues to generate these numbers. That these are often the parents who grew up in households where one or both parents were using alcohol and drugs at high risk ways. That often the people coming into PCAP were 65% of the time physically and sexually abused as a child. CPS, Child Protective Services, in at least a third, and this one is probably underreported because sometimes the people that are enrolling don't know, but about 34% involved in an external system coming into and intervening in their home. That when you look at that adverse childhood experiences, and in this case, it's the original 10 questions, ACEs screening, that the average score is 5.4 out of the original 10 questions. I know in my county, because we can break our data down by county, the score is actually 6.7. So in that range of adversity where it's indicative of negative health trajectories. And then I think something that we don't necessarily pay enough attention to, that 37% of the women are reporting that they did not finish high school for one reason or another, and are often struggling with receptive language skills, with comprehension, even though they can articulate very well most of the time. This is the other piece, of course, that's always missing when you're looking at adversity is that wider social context. I mean, it's so much more than 10 sources of adversity going on inside a family that were the focus of the original 10 questions. But looking again at advanced or its circuitry issues like ADHD and autism spectrum disorder, also with things that are going on in the community, poverty, violence, lack of housing, lack of opportunity. How safe is the general community and the specific neighborhoods? Looking at other social inequities and adversity, including racism, sexism, ageism, all the things that create a bias and a change in opportunities for people as well. And when you add this piece in, I think we are often working with a population of people that have had a lot of what we often consider to be trauma, but certainly adversity in a way that is going to influence how their brain sees and reacts to the world. And that's where I really feel that this information is so helpful, is that we're working with a high-risk population, and often when they arrive at our doorsteps, however whatever services we're offering, that when you look at the impact of early trauma, Dr. Chan Hellman from the University of Oklahoma, who is the author and main researcher around the science of hope, and has created a training opportunity called Hope Centered and Trauma Informed, is well thought of in the community. He's narrowed down and identified through his research that when people are arriving with a lot of trauma, that you can expect to see a wide array of threat responses, and that these 10 are the most common. You're going to have struggles with trusting others, expectations of danger and harm, reactivity, both emotionally and physically, expectations that this isn't going to work, that you're going to let me down too, shame of the sort that can create distance in relationships, sometimes defensive aggression, difficulty expressing positive emotions, and fear of loss of control. I think when I've presented this in our community and throughout Washington State, most people identify that this is often the presentation of someone coming into services, and that it's sort of an uphill climb to begin to build relationship, given that these impacts are already in place. And yet, I think that this science really helps us see the way and create a path through those threat responses as well. I'm going to offer Caitlin, who is someone that's a compilation of several of our clients, um, with one in particular in mind, not the person pictured. Uh, this is a fairly typical PCAP client. She came to us. She had recently moved here from another state. She was 38 years old at the time of intake, divorced. She had two children in their late teens and was estranged from both of them. She was pregnant. She said she wasn't sure who the father was. She was fleeing an intimate partner violence situation. Um, she had some family locally in Washington, and at this point, it had no prenatal care. She was unsure of her due date. She was actively using methamphetamine daily. She was very heavy cannabis and nicotine user, even though she had significant and long diagnosed COPD that was progressing. She voiced suicidal ideation a lot. This was not an occasional mention. She seemed really intent on not making it through this pregnancy. And she was, when we made our initial attempts to refer her or help her access services, medical services, she was openly combative. She had a genuine and deep-seated fear around being in hospitals or being in doctor's offices as well. After she enrolled in PCAP, she attempted daily, multiple times a day, to let me know that she didn't deserve a spot, that she didn't want services, that she didn't understand why I wouldn't just let her leave. And yet we kept insisting that she stay. So given this picture of uh, heavy trauma in her own background, current health challenges, she was assigned to a case manager who is one of my calmest case managers. And I'll conclude today's presentation by sharing a little bit about what the outcomes have been 18 months into our 3-year program. Overall, when you're looking at how to approach working with clients with such a heavy background, we've gotten so much better at being trauma informed. To me, trauma informed in a nutshell really looks at that shift from saying what's wrong with you to something instead that's more inquiry based about what happened to you. And I think even more importantly, how did you make sense of it? How has that shown up in your life? So that's our basic approach to working with people with a heavy background of trauma. I think what being neuro-informed does is widen the relationship lens. It provides a larger context because in every relationship, you're bringing your brain as well as meeting the brain of the person who's seeking services from you. So it really looks at the intricate connection between those two brains, but also between the brain, our organs, and our behaviors. And I think in many ways, it points more concretely to why interventions might fail and how interventions might work. The brain is such an amazing organ, 3 pounds of basically a silly putty-like system with billions of neural connections sitting inside a black box on top of our spine. And it controls all the systems in the body. I know people know this, but I am unfortunately a neuro nerd. If I could go back and do my career over, this is probably all I'd ever want to look at. When you think about the brain, it's an amazing system. It's constantly seeking balance among our systems. It's so critical that we have the right amount of oxygen. Too much oxygen is fatal. Too little oxygen is fatal. It's critically important that we have the right level of blood flowing through our heart. Too much blood, fatal. Too little blood, fatal. So the brain is doing this intricate calculating all the time on how to keep us alive. And that is really at least part of the focus of today is let's start with this idea that the brain is in control of our survival. Regardless of what background we bring to it, the brain is in control. So we're going to do sort of a predictive brain processing 101. So this is the big picture. And what we're going to do in the rest of our time together is really look at taking this apart and understanding why it's significant in terms of building resilience and stability in someone's life. So let's start with sensory input because this is where it all kicks off. When you think about sensory input, again, our central nervous system, our brain, our peripheral nervous system, amazingly complex picture. We're getting sensory input both externally and internally through our eyes, our ears, our sense of taste, our interoception, our internal sense. The estimate overall is that we receive about 11 million bits or pieces of sensory input in any given minute, constantly being offered data internally and externally. And I think the thing that was most amazing to me is I was learning this. The 11 million, by the way, it's an approximation, but it's a decent approximation based on the research. So looking at all that, it, it's all going on. It's all going on all the time. However, by the time we're adults, we can really only focus on about 40 to 50 pieces of that sensory input at any given time. And I think the thing that's important for the sake of people that are working with other people is the 40 or 50 pieces of sensory input that I'm focused on may very well not be the same 40 or 50 pieces of information that you're focused on. I'm pretty sure when we went into the emergency room with Caitlin, that the 40 or 50 things that were rising to the level of my focus were not the same as the ones that were creating a panicky sense for her. And that's important. Uh, I think, to widen our lens as well. Okay, so at this point, I want to pose that age-old philosophical question just to look at how sensory input can vary in really concrete ways. So here it is. This is it. If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one to hear it, does it make a sound? You didn't realize you were in for this today, but we're going to address that. I think when I've asked this question and allowed people to vote on it and there's a chance to be interactive, it's a no-brainer. People say yes. Of course it makes a sound. It's falling. It's hitting the ground. The interesting thing, though, is if you asked a neuroscientist if that was the case, if the tree made a sound, if no one was around, the answer would be uncategorically no. Because they look at sound, and audiologists as well. Thank you for the little smiley face. They make the point that it requires sound doesn't exist in the outside world. It requires a mammalian ear and a brain to actually hear sound. Sound is created in the brain. Really, what happens when a tree falls is where the ear is gathering vibrations and changes in air pressure, and then turning them into a signal that the brain then labels sound based on what we understand that sound to be. It's not the same for everybody. If you asked a very young child or a newborn, or even, let's say, a toddler who was capable of some words, they wouldn't have a context for the sound of a tree falling and hitting the forest floor. So for them, the brain wouldn't know what to label that, not until they had words and had context for that experience. Same thing with our vision. We think we see and experience everything if our eyes are capable of seeing within the visual light spectrum. So if we have operating red, green, blue cones, we can see a combination of, I think it's like 18,000 colors. And most of us looking at this picture, I'm assuming, are experiencing red bears on a green background. However, if several of your cones were misshapen, or my understanding is even one was misshapen, you might not experience red or green the same way. People that can see red, green, and all those other colors are considered trichromatic, but a lot of people are considered dichromatic or monochromatic, which we commonly refer to as color blindness. So what's the point of pointing this out? Most of us are familiar with this. What does this have to do with working with people? I hope what it does is illustrate how incredibly complex our sensory world actually is. We take so much for granted that other people are sensing the world the way that we are, but it really behooves us to begin to understand that that's not the case, and to be more curious about what people are receiving through their senses. I mean, we see this in the legal system all the time. Three people trying to describe a crime or an automobile accident generally have three different stories of what happened. And of course, it's more impactful than that as well. So moving on from sensory input, which starts this process, I want to move us into what's been labeled statistical prediction. And I think this is really kind of the crux. These two things should be in balance. Statistical prediction is adding that element of what have we experienced. And it's interesting because it doesn't just ask the question, what is this that I'm seeing, hearing, sensing? But what is this most like? And that is the game changer question. When you look at how the brain works overall, what is this most like based on my previous experiences? And that is where each one of us becomes very unique in the meaning that we make of the world. So overall, these two things should be in some balance, informing one another back and forth. And yet, when things go out of balance, there really can be a sensory overload. And the thing we probably don't think about as much, there can also be an experience overload. When there's too much evidence coming in that informs our statistical predictions to the point where new sensory input doesn't make any sense anymore, it can't sway, or it pushes the statistical prediction out of balance. I think of that sometimes when I think of people just scrolling through social media on and on and on and on, and getting sometimes conspiratorial because sensory input no longer has the balancing impact that it should have. It's gotten weighed too heavily. So to take us back to when things even they are in balance, something happens in the world, and the brain has to start a process again to help us survive. So it's asking, what is this most like based on my past experiences? But even more critically, because the brain is all about survival, you can boil it down to the overly simplistic question of, will it eat me? Can I eat it? That is what the brain ultimately is most interested in discovering. It is what keeps us alive. Is it helpful or harmful? Is it friend or foe? You know, how are we going to deal with this? And if the answer is even a little bit that it's most like something that will eat me, a process begins. If you think about it, it makes sense. You can put off eating, and although anyone who knows me knows I don't put off eating all that often. However, if something were my brain was registering high threat, I would definitely prioritize dealing with that as well. And that is true of all the people that we work with. We have this, again, I'm so sure that most of you are familiar with this, but maybe not familiar with this in this framework. How important this negativity bias is. It is the brain's default system. It is going to move toward threat or over-identify threat because its primary purpose, again, is to keep us alive and to try to regain some sort of balance within the system. The brain's default, assuming the worst, can seem to protect you the most. It doesn't mean there aren't errors, there often are, but this is a fast system. And it will throw us into what I'm going to call the red loop. Really, it's your threat response, your system going under stress. I think that's how many of us learned it. When you look at it, the first thing to look at is things go out of balance. At the point where a threat is detected, you have this internal process, interoception. If any of you are really interested in interoception, there is some wonderful research going on now at the Scripps Research Institute by a man named Arden Patap. Oh, I'm going to put his name in the slide so that you can see it. But there was he recently won a Nobel prize around his work about how intricate our sense of touch is and how that can throw all our internal organs out of balance. But this is the important part, is that we move from homeostasis, the body's balance system, where our heart is pumping ideally, where our elimination is happening in when it's needed, to an unbalanced system, an allostatic load indicates that the heart may be racing. Maybe you feel more emotional. Maybe you feel an urgent need to eliminate, but something has happened internally that has thrown your whole system and your organ system into, I've got to figure out how to react to this threat. And the body does it by dumping cortisol and adrenaline. And with that becomes more unbalanced as the body tries to prepare itself to fight, flight, freeze, or other things. And I'll get to that in a minute. There's a chemical dump, according to my little chart. And the question that, Nadine Burke-Harris, I think, poses this situation the most. And if you're not familiar with her work, she's currently the Surgeon General in California and has a wonderful TED Talk that involves this scenario. What would you do if you're walking in the park and a bear jumps out from behind a tree? What would you do? Most people respond that they would run, that they would scream, that they would freeze. The people that are outdoorsmen and or former scouts of some sort or another will say, well, if it's brown, you lay down. If it's black, you get big and fight back. And if it's white, you pray with all your might. Apparently, a polar bear will kill you as soon as look at you. Um, but one way or another, the body is going to attempt to find safety. And it isn't always by laying down or fighting back or praying with all your might. But it's going to find some way to try to bring that body back into what it perceives as safety. So these might be fight responses. Hitting, pushing, screaming, biting, lying. They could be running responses, withdrawing, hiding, freezing, maybe surrender by complying. That sort of, yeah, oh, yeah, I'll do that. Or dissociation. And then whole variety of other motor responses that are based on our own backgrounds, our family of origin, our culture, our values, our belief systems, our multi-generational heritages. That all those things matter too. There really is no universal response. And I am going to indulge myself and just take a minute to tell a story about a time that I was face to face with a bear with a former partner. We were hiking in the Maine woods. People had been telling us all day long that there was a bear, but we were 5 miles into what was going to be a multi-day hike. We didn't believe it. We were young and we really didn't have any experience with bears. And we set up our tent, we put our food in the tree, we set out our dinner by the campfire, and we went into the tent to play cribbage or some such thing. I'm facing the back of the tent, he's facing the front of the tent, and all of a sudden he looks up and says, "Oh, there's a bear." Again, big surprise after we'd been warned and warned and warned. My first reaction was I was going to run as fast as I could. I asked, where's the knife? With the idea that I was going to slit the back of the tent and get out of there as fast as I could. And just to give you an example of what etc. might include, his reaction was, "Where's my camera?" And he proceeded to try to take pictures of the bear who was at this point dismantling our food in the tree. So just to sort of illustrate, I hope with a smile, that we don't know what we'll do in these situations, nor can we always predict what the other person will do as well. And it can become more impactful over time because the brain, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of metabolic energy to run a threat response, to maintain that level of awareness and muscle awareness to get ready to fight, flight, free, or do others. Uh, you need it. It's critical. It's what keeps us alive. I mean, heck, when we're in a threat response and we're having that chemistry dump, studies show that we tend to bleed less should the bear actually attack. We can run faster. We can do all those things. Where it becomes problematic and draining is when the bear comes home with you and that system is running all the time. The brain starts to prioritize once it's used its initial chemical energy, it's going to start borrowing from other body systems. Essentially the logic is, if you're about to be eaten by a bear, you probably don't need to be digesting your lunch. If you're about to be eaten by a bear, it doesn't matter if your circadian rhythms are really running smoothly, those rhythms that keep you like awake and asleep cycles. It probably doesn't matter if your reproductive system is operating or not. And so energy is being borrowed from all those other systems. And over time, that creates pathology. It creates disease processes as well. So when you're looking at this, you have this picture of going out of balance, having necessary chemistry to help you survive, moving you into a behavioral pattern that becomes very maladaptive over time, if I can use that word, and actually is energy draining and can become a disease process in and of itself. I think one of the more fascinating parts of this is the return arrow. Because when you are drained, when you have gone through this process, when you are living this process, over time, that really changes the way that you interpret sensory input coming in. And this really becomes that phenomenon that we call trauma. Because when you think about it, if you have had this life-threatening experience, it doesn't seem too surprising to me that your brain would take note of that. If you've had this experience or you're sort of living with a bear to use that metaphorically, you might, after a while, again, start avoiding that park, start avoiding that path in the woods, maybe avoid trees altogether. That does not seem at all surprising to me because the brain is going to remember we almost died in this situation. This was a threat, and it will start dripping adrenaline and cortisol at perhaps even the sight of trees, certainly of that park. And in some individuals, if their brains are sensitive enough and or if the experience has been extremely life-threatening, it might be that the brain starts dripping cortisol and adrenaline on Wednesday because Wednesday is the day that this attack happened. So this is a phenomenon. Sometimes we label it PTSD, but it changes our experiences. It changes the way we see sensory input, the way we hear things, the way we see things, and can keep us in a threat response with the negative health outcomes that can come with that. I also suspect, as someone who's worked as a substance use disorder professional for most of my professional career, that this is really where substance use begins to become a self-medication as well. You need to find some way to turn off the threat system, or if in some cases, to actually rev up the nervous system to feel something as well. However, the brain does more than just deal with threat. And I think this is the next part of this as well. If you had a baby in the woods and they were faced with the same sensory input that equaled bear in the adult mind, tall, furry, ears on the top, nose on the front, if you had no experience of bear, you might not begin to go into a threat response. And in fact, your brain, much like that adult brain, would try to identify what is this most like in my experience? And that might be something that is not threatening. This both makes children and adults very vulnerable when they haven't had experience of things that are actual threats. And it also points to the fact that if something is perceived as threatening and it is actually not, that the brain then needs to go and start to address the other part of the loop. The brain has to pay attention to resources that are critical for survival too. That other side is, can I eat it? So we have this default to can it eat me, but we have to keep in mind that we also need to pay attention to can I eat it? Is this something that I need for my survival? Because you can't constantly um, drain resources. At some point, there has to be some restoration as well. And adding the green loop onto my graphic here, at this point, the body may be able to move into a more balanced interoception. There's still a chemical dump going on. However, it tends to be once the brain has determined this is something I need, the chemistry dump then becomes more about what we sometimes label the happy brain chemicals or that the happy chemicals that include oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, vasopressins as well. The things that tend to allow metabolic rebuilding rather than metabolic drain. You can look at it in some ways. If you go down to this idea that with this chemistry dump, your body is being geared up for social engagement. In some ways, social engagement is the opposite of fight, flight, freeze, or et cetera behaviors. Instead, it pulls us into being prepared for connection with others. And again, I think I'm a storyteller at heart. So I'm going to just tell a quick story about the human brain and how right from birth we are wired and then tuned to um, engage in social engagement for the sake of our survival. We are large social mammals, much like this horse pictured here. And just as a contrast, because we tend to think of the human brain as the pinnacle of brains, it's just different from other large social mammals and adapted to our environment. So here's my story about this horse. If you stepped back from this picture a frame or two, I want you to imagine that the mother horse is pregnant. She gives birth somewhere in this field to this beautiful little foal, and she's licked off the birth matter, but she's also aware that there's a scent of cougar in the air, of mountain lion in the air. And so I often ask audiences when I show this, like, what's going to happen next? What is she doing? Most common reply is, oh, they're bonding, she's sniffing him. And I would challenge that. I would push back on that. And what I think she's doing, and other horse people have affirmed me, is she's about to push him up to his feet. She's going to encourage him to get up on those four beautiful spindly legs so that he can nurse and so that he is not the mountain lion's lunch. That's how this horse survives. In a year, she's not going to throw him a birthday party. She's not going to worry about whether he goes to the prom. She's not going to worry if he's being bullied by his peers. Those things aren't critical to horse survival, but his standing up is. This little guy, on the other hand, when we're thinking about social engagement and how critical it is to human brain development, is born woefully unconnected in terms of his brain architecture. So imagine this picture. Mom is pregnant. She is in the wild fields of Costco or some other big box store. She gives birth. She licks off the birth matter, and she nudges this little person to his feet. She takes his hand, they walk out, she buys him a Costco membership. And most people smile at that because it does seem ridiculous. What we know is he doesn't need a Costco membership, among other things. He doesn't need that. What he needs is social engagement. He needs to engage a caregiver to help him, or he won't survive. His brain is unsophisticated in its wiring at this point. All the potentials are there. However, things have not yet really pruned and tuned and grown together in a way that would allow him to survive on his own. And I think we all know that, but I also think it bears pointing out once again that he can't do a whole lot more than signal for his initial needs to be met. And it's so interesting when you look at oxytocin, or that chemical that we often call the love hormone. The highest level of oxytocin in a person who's born female, the highest level it's ever going to be is not at the birth of her first child, but at the birth of her second and beyond. And so if you ever have wondered, am I going to have enough love to be able to care for a second or third child? The answer is nature gives you a little boost. Your brain gives you a little bit of extra bonding or love chemical so that this person gets what they need so that the species can survive as well as this individual person as well. Just another side note, and keeping an eye on time. We all do this. We go into our offices after a baby has been born in our life, a child, a grandchild, a neighbor's child, and we want to show everyone the picture. And I think if you were actually reading social cues, most of them are going, "Oh, yeah, that's pretty nice." We learn to, or "Oh, how beautiful," because we've learned to play that game. But the reality is, when we look at pictures of our own loved ones, our own babies in our life, that's who gets the oxytocin bump, not the person that you're showing the picture to. So it's a more meaningful experience. Just a thought for the day. Having these chemicals, having social engagement really is energy replenishing. And I think that, again, is something to keep in mind when you're looking at why it is so important to survival that we also spend time on the green loop and not only in the threat loop. That this is the rest and digest system. These are the things that can improve. You can heal. Your doctors like this state because it helps recovery. And I was thinking about it from a substance use disorder point of view. It really is the things that we encourage people to do when they are recovering from substance use disorder as well, that they need to find time to rest, to digest, to engage in healthy social engagement as well. And really, all of this points to the final return arrow, which is the biological reality of resilience. If we were, again, threat system needed, but if we spent all our time there, the health effects would eventually become fatal. We have to find balance in our systems. The green system is just as critical to survival as the red system as well. We often talk about being triggered into threat responses, things that create anxiety or discomfort or disease or unbalanced interoception. But equally, we can be triggered into replenishment, into this green loop as well. Just thinking about sensory inputs, like from a pleasant time. Someone suggested, think of your pet pleasures, not your pet peeves or your guilty pleasures, but your pet pleasures. And just by focusing on those sensory input memories and our statistical predictions around them, you can begin to experience more of the benefits of the green or renewal loop, the safety loop, and can actually begin to shift away from threat response in the face of no actual threat. And that really is the biological reality of resilience. We talk about resilience as bounce back and things like that. And that is actually the psychological observation of what happens when our body has balanced and we are in this chemical and energy renewing process. That's the real neuro definition of what resilience is. I would offer an example again of how this can work. I had a wonderful second family growing up, and to get to their house in the summer, you would drive through these fields in Pennsylvania, and there was always the scent of jasmine in the air because it was usually when school let out and the night was just filled with the scent of jasmine. I was this past summer somewhere where the scent of jasmine hit me, and it was like I was instantly transported 50 years into the past. And it immediately like brought a smile to my face. It just shifted everything from what had been a long and frustrating day, just that little scent of jasmine in the air, it really led to a different set of feelings. And I don't mean to be overly simplistic about this. I get it. It's not that easy. However, it is biologically called for that at some point, when we're looking at the things that trigger that threat response, there should be a pause where you can begin to think, how can I shift this over into something that will actually renew and help me, that will really nurture resilience in my system, um, in the face of no real threat. So the biology of resilience in a sentence, it's shifting a threat response to safety by shifting sensory input, or memory. I think this is critical. It takes so little to tank a relationship or to make it difficult, for the relationship to really deepen and become more of a resource for people. So I'm going to ask you to think of it when you're in that red loop, that threat loop, how quickly things can go sideways. You can think of it as a combo meal deal of sensory input and statistical prediction. More important is it is so fast. It happens so quickly. I think it was like 1/20,000th of a second for your brain to begin to change your body chemistry. It doesn't take a lot of repetition. I'm not sure about my ex-partner, but I'm pretty sure for me, I don't need to have a bear jump out at me more than once, to know that I'd rather not put myself in that situation again, and that maybe I'll pay attention if someone tells me there's been a bear sighting. You only have to put your hand on a hot stove once, and pretty soon you realize, I don't have to keep doing this. I get it. This is our primary system. It's your brain's default, and it is slippery, steep, and short. It doesn't take long. It goes fast. It's hard to climb back out. Your brain, again, is over sensitive to moving into this, especially when there's a background of trauma. But again, the point of a whole person lens is it's not just the person with the background of trauma, it's all of us. And that when we're looking at the green response system, it also is a combination of sensory input and statistical prediction. However, it's much, much slower, so much harder to build a relationship than to jeopardize a relationship. It does take more repetition. You have to go through endless cycles of relationship rupture repair, relationship rupture repair. And again, I think about our PCAP clients. We offer a relationship, we set the stage for relationship. There's a lot of ruptures, appointments that aren't kept, no-shows when people have scheduled home visits, sometimes those sort of reactionary, emotional reactionary things, not trusting, not sharing. All of those rupture or potentially rupture a relationship. And so it becomes kind of dependent on the person who's providing the lead in the relationship to just keep trying again. Because it does take more repetition to help people begin to shift what might be an initial threat response at the idea of being in a relationship, let alone with someone who they don't know, with another agency that they might not trust. You've got to be willing to be into it for the long run, because this slope is also slippery and it's also steep, but it's long. You have to keep putting one foot in front of another and moving uphill. So I like these two visuals as a way of thinking about what it means to invest in a relationship that is intended to build safety and trust and resilience for someone. So looking at Caitlin, to go back to that, her case manager was probably one of the most low-key, mild-mannered case managers I think I've ever worked with. She's been consistent, non-confrontational. She has gone out of her way to use supervision so she doesn't react at times to what are often triggering things for her. She works hard at providing unconditional positive regard. And I think the most critical thing when you think about it from a service intervention, she's quietly insistent that they keep doing goal work together, which is one of the centerpieces of the PCAP intervention. And then she honors those goals. They don't go to the back burner. She keeps bringing them up. So Caitlin, 18 months into a 3-year enrollment, still is not abstinent, but she is more stably housed. She's at her sister's house, so she's had some reunion with family. She has regular and rewarding visits with her 16-month-old son. She is not the primary caregiver, but she's overall far less reactive to the point where she was even able to tolerate a dental visit that was much needed. She can reflect on her previous behaviors, which I think is such a hallmark of how well she's doing, and really is invested in learning new ways of relating to others. Not all of our clients experience this in 18 months. However, it's certainly possible. And if you had asked me when I first enrolled her, how long it would take, I would have said probably all 3 years because she really was so impaired, so deeply in a threat response. And yet it did not take that long. And I know there's other programs that invest that kind of energy and insight into building relationships. And I applaud you for that because I think that is what it takes. We really have to look at the lens we choose to view others with and how we view ourselves. And it really can change outcomes at a cellular level from what the research is telling us, but certainly at a community level, and certainly at a personal level as well, an interrelational level. Relevant service have to be neuro-informed as well as trauma-informed. We have to really think about what's going on in the brain and how it operates, not just the brain of the people that come to us for help, but also in our own. We have to be willing to invest enough duration and intensity to ensure the family actually benefits and can show some progress. Resilience is certainly a desired outcome, as is recovery. I think we do that really by learning to tell a different story about ourselves, about the people we work with, and the threats and challenges we all face. I don't think we talk about these things nearly enough, and I love to be part of that conversation in an ongoing way with any agency across the country. Telling about it doesn't always exchange the external situation, but it can change body chemistry and build resilience. I promised a short slide of the two people that this information was most influenced by, and Rick Griffin has lots and lots of trainings that take this basic information about the predicting brain and look at everything from neuro collaborating to neuro learning to neuro teaching. They're really very helpful. And then Lisa Feldman Barrett has a lot of resources, TED Talk, a good website if you're interested in learning more. I would recommend a very short book called 7.5 Lessons About the Brain if you're not familiar with her work. It's if you're an Audible book person, you can listen to it if you have an hour's drive, maybe a little more than an hour. But I would recommend researching both these people if this is of interest to you. And then I'm going to go ahead and say thank you and see if there's some questions. I want to thank Northwest Addictions Technology and Transfer Center. It's a thrill to be one of their presenters, the Addictions Drug and Alcohol Institute and PCAP, who are all part of the Washington State system that supports people with substance use disorder. And special thanks to Dr. Susan Stoner, the current executive director at the University of PCAP at the University of Washington. I certainly want to thank all the parents and families. What an honor. Washington Healthcare Authority and the Division of Behavioral Health and Recovery funds programs, including PCAP, and of course the colleagues, especially the colleagues that I work with directly who let me bounce my ideas off of them and offer their experiences as well. Please feel free to contact me. I would love to hear from you, and let's see if we have any quick questions.
Thank you so much, Linda. That was great information, and I appreciate the stories peppered throughout. That was really nice. I haven't really seen any obvious questions, but I did want to let people know that we We have our evaluation survey link that's in the chat box there. Please take that. We'll also be sending it out in an email. And be sure to join us for our next webinar on January 21st. We're still